From Maine to New Mexico, Arkansas to Oregon, Civic Network Television is lighting up America. CNT, linking America's communities to each other and the future. Live from Washington, D.C., Civic Network Television brings you Mobilizing Community Assets. And now, our moderator, Ramona Evelyn.
Let's move on to Module 4, the power of local institutions.
Okay, thank you, Ramona. I think that our discussion in this next part of the community building curriculum will tie directly into our last set of discussions about associations, because we want to begin to contrast, in fact, this sector, the citizens association sector, with the local institution sector. We're walking through this map now toward the outer ring, and I think the way we want to sort of frame this discussion is to say, if we thought about building a house, or if we thought about building a community, one of the things we need to think about is what tools do we have to do it, right? And our wonderful crew here at CNT has made us a model of a couple of tools, much better than either John or I could do. Here we have a hammer and a saw, right? Now, neither of us is going to pretend to be adept at using either of these tools, but we want to at least make the point that the way we'd like to talk about institutions and to introduce the institutional challenge, if you will, is to say that one kind of a tool does one thing in building a house and another does another. So if we thought about what we've just been talking about, the associational life of the community as this circle of gifted citizens that have come together that do the work of community building, and if we thought about this sort of triangle, sort of more hierarchical, boxes connected in a kind of hierarchical way, as a way of visualizing what an institution is. I think the way we'd like to begin talking about this is to say that systems and institutions are one kind of tool that are very different from the community and associational tool. And we want to explore then this sector, the institutional and systemic sector, its utility. But we want to do it by being very, very upfront and clear about the challenges involved in using this tool, this hammer. We don't want to hit each other over the thumb continuously, right, and bleed. We want to be able to use this hammer, this set of institutions, well. So the first thing we want to do, the first set of challenges we want to explore briefly, is to say, what is the difference between a hammer and a saw, between an institution and a community? And then we're going to take up a second set of challenges. And the second set of challenges has to do with who controls this tool. We're going to be talking about the fact that in communities we've got a whole lot of institutions, schools and parks and libraries and businesses, police. But in lots of communities, our institutions are not connected to the community building agenda. So the question is a question of who controls, who sets the agenda. How do we begin to think about that in terms of the power of local institutions? But first, let's explore this question about the different nature of these two tools. John, do you want to lead us through a little bit of thinking about that?
You know, I think the reason that it's probably useful for us to think about these two different ways of organizing people to do things is because increasingly there's a confusion about them. And sometimes we are using systems or institutions to try to do what communities can only do. And if you tried to use a hammer to do what only a saw could do, you wouldn't succeed very well, right? You can use a hammer to cut a board in half, but it'll be a mess. So the question is, if we could understand what is this way of organizing people, the community way, the associational way, what is that good for? And what is the system way good for, the institutional way? Then we can begin to have a team, to begin to understand how to go ahead in communities. Now, let's see if we can remind you of the difference between these two ways of doing things. First of all, let's think about systems or institutions. When I'm at the university, across the street is a place called the Graduate School of Management, right? And that's a place where they teach people how to make these systems work, right? That's what a manager is, somebody up here who is working one of these ways of doing things. And so when we have talked to people at the Graduate School of Management and we say, what is this way of doing things good at? Why is it organized this way? They've said to us, there are three important things about this way of doing things, the system or institutional way. And the first one, they say, is that this is a way of organizing people for control. It is so that a few people can control a lot of people. Right? So if you want to control people by a few, this is a good way. Now that's not bad, is it? I came here today on an airplane, right? And I want that organized this way. I don't want it organized this way. I don't want the pilot saying, well, folks, where should we go today, right? And, we're just a community here, right? I want to be appropriately using a system, right? And so when you want to have people controlled, it's a good way. Now, the second thing is, they tell us over at the Graduate School of Management, is the reason, basically, in modern times that we've created this way of doing things is for mass production, in order to produce a lot of the same thing, to produce lots of the same, right? and think about an automobile company, right? A few people think about how a Chevrolet ought to look, and thousands of people must follow them exactly in order to have a Chevrolet that we can all be sure is always the same. Right? So the reason we set things up this way is to be able to take the mind of a few and put it into the hands of many, to set uniformity and standards. But the other thing that then we can realize is that if what we want to have is something that is individualized, that is just appropriate for Sherman and not for everybody, this is the wrong tool. And we have a lot of people in human services that are burning out because they're being asked to use a system in ways that it won't work. They're trying to be told to individualize everything. Right? Doesn't work. It's not what it's for. The third thing that is characteristic here is that it produces a client, right? In other words, it doesn't do any good to have this whole thing organized if you don't have clients. So the bigger it gets, the more clients you need, or the more consumers you need. So the outcome of using this is to always have a demand for more clients and consumers, not producers and citizens. Now, if we look over at associations and say, well, now, what are they for? What are they good at? Why are they organized as tools? The first thing is they're not about control at all. They're about consent. Right? By that, I mean that if you're an association, think of the ones that you named, right? Nobody can tell the people in that association what to do. Can't even tell them to come to the meetings, right? so that when I'm in the university in a classroom, I may have a group of people in that room, but I control them. But as soon as I go to a local association, then something else happens. Then I'm one like the others, right? So it's where consent works. But that's what democracy is about, consent. That's why power grows from association, not from system. Now, the second thing we know is that it can't produce a thing. Associations don't produce stuff. They don't produce services, for instance. But what they do allow and are the center of is care. You see, systems can't produce care. Medicare doesn't care. Can't care. It's a big system, sends checks out. And this is a terrible confusion we have these days, that systems can care. And this is, I think, the explanation for a lot of the problems we call youth problems, is that we have come to the idea that a system can take over the lives of our young people and have programs and curriculums, and somehow those people will grow up as members of community. But what they're getting is a service, and what they're not getting is care. And so it is pretty apparent, I think, that if you want to deal with what are called youth problems or elderly problems or all of the social problems that we're talking about today, it's this tool that is essential if care is where you want to come out. Why are people in the room, in the association that you belong to? Because they care about something. Why are they out cleaning out the highways? Because they care. They're not saying, pay me. They say, I care. And third and last, they can't produce clients. They can't produce consumers. They aren't about that. They're about citizens. Right? And so you can see that we have two worlds. One world which is a world of the power of productive people, and the other is the power of controlled people. And when we talk about community services, I think we're confused. Systems can't produce community or services or care. Right? When we use community in relationship to systems, I think we're getting confused. We're talking about a hammer, and what we need is a saw. So the sorting out, I think, at the community level is critical, is for us to understand the difference between these two. And especially to recognize that as this grows larger and larger, it can overwhelm this. That systems can try to replace and push out associations. And when they do, the community will be weak and fully served. And we need communities fully citizened and systems that are servants. So we want to come back then to the question of control. And that is, who does control these systems has a lot to do with whether or not systems are going to be servants or whether they're going to be lords. Jody?
What's interesting, John, about what you've just sort of introduced us to and the nature of these two tools is then to think about all of us. I think in some way or other we are all people who have one foot in each of those two worlds, right? Part of us operates in an institutional or a systemic world, right? We're part of these big things. We fly on them. We work in them, right? We produce in them. But we also have a foot in community. And I think what we're thinking about here is to say now, which foot can do which kind of work? Where should we be leading? What foot should be leading down which path, right? And that's the sort of exploration we're in at this point. And I think there's an awful lot of reinvention that we have to do in terms of our problem-solving capacities that has to do with understanding these two tools. Now, the second dilemma that goes beyond the nature of the two tools and the difference between what they can do well and what they don't do so well is this question about who controls these things. If we're interested in using this hammer, these institutions and systems to build communities, how is it that we can begin to understand the process which would take place if a community were to recapture them? Because I think what we see in a lot of our neighborhoods at this point is that our neighborhoods are filled with these things, with schools, and with parks, and with police, and with service agencies, and with a whole lot of other kinds of institutions, which might as well, for all that they contribute to community building, be on Mars, right? They are places that are somehow accountable not to the community that they're in, but to some kind of a central authority, or to some kind of an idea about what the professional standard is for performance in this particular kind of institution. So we've been asking the question, how is it that communities could in fact retake the institutions that are already geographically located there? And what would happen when local citizens begin in fact doing that? One of the settings that we've learned an awful lot from over the last couple of years has been a story that is a complicated story, but a rich one that's been unfolding in Chicago. And it's the story of the Chicago public schools, of all things, right? What's happened in the Chicago public schools, there are about 552 of them. It's a huge system. Over 400,000 kids, employs over 40,000 people, multi-billion-dollar system, one of the biggest of these, right? What has happened is that there was a consensus reached about 8 or 10 years ago that was sort of captured by then Secretary of Education Bennett, who kept coming to Chicago and telling us, you have the worst school system in the country. And everybody in Chicago would nod and say, that's right, we do. Teachers would nod, the school board would nod, the political leadership would nod, and certainly the parents and community folks would nod. What happened was, when we faced I think it was our 9th teacher strike in 18 years, right? And the schools were closed for yet another 3 or 4 week period, throwing families and communities into chaos. We had a little revolution in Chicago. And the revolution, in fact, came about in such a way that local communities decided, you know, I don't think we could do any worse than the big system is doing. If we took our schools back into communities, we could probably make them work. And so I want to introduce you now to one of the leaders in Chicago school reform who's helped shape that reform and been at the center of it. We introduce you to Ann Hallett, who's the head now of a group that's working on the relationship between schools and communities nationwide called the Cross-City Campaign for Urban School Reform. Ann, could you describe for us Chicago school reform?
Chicago school reform has had the effect of moving significant power to the local schools. There's a local school council that is parent majority, 6 parents, 2 community members, 2 teachers, and the principal that have real power. For the major amount of power of any urban system in the country. So the local school councils hire and fire the principal and put that person on a 4-year performance contract. And they have significant authority over budget and over local school improvement planning and implementation. One of the really important things of Chicago school reform is that it unleashed civic energy around schools and really we're about reclaiming a very important public institution back into community life. For example, there's a high school and its feeder schools here called the Orr High School Network. A community group helped to organize a coalition of principals, and they began to, for the first time, do things together. After about 4 years, they recognized that they could not, as a principal said to me, I used to think I could do education in my classroom if I could get the school just right and the teachers trained, but after 4 years I realized I can't do it alone. So the principals now, the high school network, have created and set up a development council to really work on economic development in the neighborhood, to bring in other neighborhood resources to do other neighborhood work. So the schools have created a neighborhood organization to continue work that needs to be done in order to really get kids educated. They're interested in setting up student businesses on neighborhood business strips, for example, and really make the schools part of community life once again.
So one of the important things to recognize about this little revolution that's happened in Chicago schools is that these local school councils that Ann described are elected. So we have elections for 6,000 new public officials in Chicago. Overnight, when Chicago school reform happened, the number of local elected officials who are African American and Latino doubled in the United States, right? Because we've got all kinds of folks. In fact, in that first election, over 20,000 people ran for local office. So it became a kind of seedbed of democracy and a seedbed of citizen participation. The school reform movement in Chicago is not a uniform success. In fact, what we have now is 552 separate stories, right? Stories that are all unique because each school, in fact, is defining itself and its own direction. These school councils are taking off in all kinds of unpredictable ways. But one of the things we're most interested in, and we're seeing it in hundreds of schools in Chicago now, is the way in which this relationship between the community and the school, the idea that a healthy community and a successful school are interrelated, are intertwined. They're absolutely part of the same agenda. This is beginning to emerge all over the place. We're even beginning now to see some educational kinds of payoffs. It takes a while for this stuff to begin to show up and so on in things like test scores. But I think we've got here in a Chicago Tribune article of about a year ago a headline which we were really proud of when it came on. It's a long way to go still, but the city school test scores are on their way up. Not across the board, not in every school, but one of the interesting things about school reform is that the successful schools cut across the kinds of communities. That is, you'll find them in the poorest communities as well as more middle-class and affluent communities. And you'll find them in all kinds of racial and ethnic enclaves in the city of Chicago. So it's a very interesting process, and we are continuously learning from that process. Now, we were talking with our colleagues here in the audience, again, about their own experience with institutions in their communities and how it is that when you were thinking about institutions in your communities, you thought about this question of control. We were asking about whether or not you had some examples of institutions in your community that had this control problem, that were in fact answerable to someplace not in the community. You were talking about.
Yes, I had one. I was talking about the parks and how they try to control the community in terms of the parks. They open up for the citizens, but at the same time, in the summertime, they close at 6 o'clock. And you tell me that teenagers are the ones who would need the parks open at 6 o'clock so that they would have the opportunity to go and it would give them something else to do.
Yeah, clearly somebody at the top of the park district downtown in city government thinks that it's a good idea for parks to close exactly when kids could use them, right? This is not the kind of a decision you would expect a community to make. Ramona, we had one other example I know that Roberta wanted to tell us about an institution that you've had something to do with that is clearly not controlled by community folks. Do you want to just...
Right. In southeastern Virginia, my apartment complex was run by the local housing authority, and I participated on the tenant association there. Like most tenant associations, they want to run the business of the apartment complex. They want to become independent of the housing authority. But because of finances, money, purse strings, proposals, what have you, the housing authority has the thumb on the association.
Yes. So clearly there were conflicts, right? There were different kinds of paths that the local association and the downtown institution wanted to happen. But what I think we're talking about here is, in fact, recognizing how these two tools differ and then understanding how the institutional tool can be captured for local community building processes by local citizens. And that's what we're seeing happen all over the place. What's absolutely fascinating about that process is that when local citizens begin looking at institutions, they see things that sometimes the professionals working in those institutions haven't seen. They view those institutions differently. We're learning that in Chicago about the schools, and now we're beginning to learn it across the country about a lot of other institutions. And John, I wonder whether you could talk about what local citizens see in these things when they begin to have some control and authority over them.
Right. And I think that's the way to put it. You can begin to see something in local institutions that you never saw when you are on top of them and you're able to look down. You know what you see. We learned this in the Dudley Street neighborhood in Boston. You begin to see that these local institutions, instead of controlling you, are in fact treasure chests. They sort of look like this. Here's a school, and this school can open up, if it's controlled by local citizens, and become a treasure chest in the community. So as we've traveled across the country and listened to local community people about when our local institutions serving them rather than controlling them, right? We have seen that when citizens gain control of local institutions, they begin to empty out the treasures of the hospital, of the community college, of the school, of the park, and make those available for community development. Now, as we've looked at schools, for instance, that have opened up to community, we have seen all kinds of treasures. And if you look at page 171 and 172 in the textbook, you'll see a list of the assets that exist in schools, the treasures we found communities using. They start with the facilities, where local communities have taken over the school when the school is closed, and the meeting place for the community is the school. Then next, the local school opens up its access to its special equipment and materials so that the local small businessmen come into the school and use the computers in the evening to do their balance sheets. The school becomes an economic development resource. Next, we see schools shifting where they purchase things. They don't purchase their school supplies 300 miles away. They purchase them in the neighborhood. They are supporting a neighborhood economy. They are a real treasure in that sense. Then the next is the employment practices of the school. It is a jobs center in its own employment practices, and some schools are really focusing on the hiring of people from the neighborhood. Another treasure in many schools is the fact that they are a place that can organize courses, and here we mean especially courses that the adults in the community as citizens give. Remember, we were saying you can inventory the educational possibilities in the community. You can run a better school after school than they can run in the school if you mobilize all the knowing that people in the community have. Then you have teachers, right? Very skilled, special, knowledgeable people who just usually you don't see in community development activities. We need them outside those classrooms, and we need them leading the kids outside those classrooms too, and that's the last resource here. Well, I guess the financial capacity, schools can also be an important vehicle for receiving money, right? And finally then, they also are the place where we have stored our young people who need to be led by their teachers out into community development activities. And the book gives all kinds of examples of all kinds of schools across the United States that have been doing that. Now, one school in Chicago that is a good example is the Lucy Flower Vocational High School. And let's talk to the principal about what they have done as they have opened themselves to community.
In a time when there are not enough jobs for students, we'd like for them to be able to create jobs for themselves and others, so that we would like to see them build those skills necessary. We started back in 1990, and at that time we were interested in starting one business, and the Scholastic Shop was that business. We formed a network, Bethel, New Life, called together 3 high schools, several businesses, several community organizations, and we formed a partnership. It was an opportunity for our students to be mentored and taught by not just in-house staff, but by community people. I can remember when we first started, the students felt this is something that I cannot do, but now they know I can do this. I can build skills. And if I choose, I can own and operate my own business. And that's what this is all about. So our whole focus is entrepreneurship. We feel that our students should get real hands-on experiences while they are in school. And so we have 6 student-run businesses here. Credit Team, Scholastic Shop, Flower Pot Cafe are 3 of those. We also have a boutique, Flower in Action, which is our built environment cluster. And we have Megabytes, printing and copying service.
Basically, the store is to teach you hands-on training for corporate America. So when you get out into the real world, you'll know what you're doing and what steps you need to do it from. Through the basic training that we had, I'm planning on being an accountant. And by me handling money and doing paperwork on money, it's showing me more of what I need to know when I become an accountant.
We have community members that come in. They eat in the Flower Pot Cafe. They purchase papers from the Scholastic Shop. They serve as mentors and volunteers within this building. Some of them have entrepreneurial skills. They come in and actually work with the students. We have community meetings in the building. We have parent meetings, so that we feel that we're really part of the community now.
So what we're seeing here clearly is a breakdown of the walls that used to separate these institutions we call schools from their surrounding community. And they become permeable, and the folks in the community are in and out of the school, and the folks in the school are in and out of the community. And in fact, the young people are coming back into the community as contributors to civic life and to economic life, and feeling like they're not useless, right? Like they haven't got anything at all to contribute. It's probably the worst thing we do to young people. So this is a way to invite them back in and say, you know, we've got all kinds of confidence that you are a community builder too, right? And if the school then is one example of a treasure chest, you open it up and look inside and you can see all that stuff in there. We're beginning now to work with communities across the United States who are looking at all of the other institutions, the parks and the libraries and the community colleges and the police and the hospitals, and opening up the lid on those too, and looking in there and finding what's there to contribute to community building. And again, we've asked our colleagues here in the studio to think about their own experience with some institutions that they're familiar with, and think about them as treasure chests, and sort of began brainstorming a little bit ahead of time about some ideas that folks had about how institutions in their communities can contribute their own treasures. And Barbara, you were thinking about one.
I actually know a community college that has opened up their auditoriums and their gyms to let students come in and use them from the high schools, which is great because usually the high schools don't have the resources. And they also allow their college students to get college credit to go out and do work in the community.
Yes, yes. The whole movement towards service learning and towards bringing young people back in that you're involved in and lots of us are involved in, it's so incredibly exciting. Right? We really have to, it's in a sense ironic that we have to organize ourselves to do that these days, right? We should sort of take it for granted, but we do have to organize ourselves to do it. And it's awfully exciting that it is happening. Rick, you were thinking about business.
Yeah, I'm actually familiar with a few local businesses here that offer the talents of their employees through either volunteering at local charities or mentoring teams, and actually starting youth apprenticeship programs to involve high school students in training programs, and actually even donating products that they would normally sell.
Absolutely. That's very exciting. I mean, again, business folks in a local community feel, I think, that they want to be part of the community building action as well. And when they're asked, not just to contribute money, but to be more creative about what they've got to offer the community, they get excited as well. Well, just to refer then, Ramona, once more to the building communities from the inside out, the pages from about 171 to 275 are filled with stories about communities reconnecting with their local institutions and finding in them all kinds of treasures. And once again, I would say that as we're listening to the discussion in Washington, D.C., and as we're thinking about the ways in which our public institutions are being driven ever more by resource scarcity, and sort of thinking about our communities as being left high and dry in lots of ways, we now have no choice but to look at our institutions and to say, if you're in our community, you're going to be contributing to the community building process.
Why don't you think about the associations that you belong to, and then think about the relationships that those associations have with other associations? What is the connection, right? And if yours aren't connected, then a question is, how can new connections and relationships be made? On the other side of it, however, has to do with the potential relationships. And here the question is, if you thought about a community goal, what would your association need to do with other associations to deal with that community's goal? For instance, reintegrating youth into our everyday life. What would the table look like if it were set with associations that were ready to say to young people in our society, come on in, we need you? And then the second assignment has to do with another chart, which isn't in your book, but you can use the associational one just as well. And it says about your institutions, think about the institutions in your community, identify them, and then take one of them and think about what that institution has as treasures inside and identify the treasures. Take a hospital, for instance. A hospital we have found is just a rich treasure chest. What does it have inside? And then the second question is, how could what it has be used in our community to make our visions come true and our possibilities grow? So what we're asking, in a way, is for you to do a first step toward identifying your associations, identifying your institutions, and then thinking about each as an asset and trying to identify how they can begin to become much more effective resources in building your community from the inside out.